Welcome to Matan's Parsha podcast, Sefer Dvarim. Each week, a different Matan teacher will share words of Torah to illuminate the parsha and your week. Today's shiur on Parshat Ki Tetze will be given by Rabbanit Nechama Goldman Barash, who teaches contemporary halacha and Talmud at Matan and studied in Matan's Advanced Talmud Institute and in Hilchata, a program for the advanced study of halacha.
The Torah portion of Ki Tetze opens up with 5 verses that describe the possibility of taking a captive woman into the Israelite home. This narrative has often been used to suggest that the Torah permits battlefield rape to assuage the unbridled lust of soldiers at war. Several years ago, a military head of the Rabbanit in the IDF became caught up in controversy when he was quoted as having taught in a Torah class that raping a non-Jewish woman during war, while not desirable, was permitted because of this parsha. If we look carefully, however, we discover that rabbis and others are heavily influenced by rabbinic and halachic interpretations of the text, in clear contradiction of the simple meaning or the simplest reading, plainest reading of the Torah text. Furthermore, battlefield rape was never sanctioned, not by the Torah, nor by the interpretations that followed. Let's take a look at the opening psukim. We're in chapter 21 of Sefer Dvarim, verses 10 to 14. What we have here is, Ki Tetze lemelchama oleivecha, untano Adonai Elohecha biyadecha v'shavita shivyo, v're'ita b'shivya eshet yifat toar v'chashakta ba v'lakachta lecha le'isha. So let's start with the opening psukim. When a man who goes out to war, an Israelite warrior, goes out to war against your enemies, and your God delivers them into your power, and you take some of them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire her and would take her to wife. So already the impetus for the parsha tells us that this is during wartime against your enemies. It's a situation in which God has already given the enemy into your hand. It's not in the caught up in the kind of bloodlust of war, in the height of the battle. It's really after the battle is over and you've begun to take captives. And you see among the captives a beautiful woman. And the phrase in the Torah is Yifat Toar. We know from the Torah many other situations of Yifat Toar, particularly in Sefer Bereshit. We know that Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, particularly Rivka and Rachel, are described as Yifot Toar. Yosef is described as Yefei Toar. We know that beauty triggers the visual stimulus. In fact, in all of the stories about beauty, and they're really grouped in Sefer Bereshit, and then again in Sefer Shmuel Aleph and Bet around David HaMelech's family, we have beautiful people, often whom are visually visible. In other words, people see them, people desire them. There's both a danger in being seen through that lens and also a privilege in that we know that Yosef and Esther and other characters in Tanakh are able to use their beauty to do good or to do bad, depending on how they make their choices. And here what we see is that the Yifat Toar stands out. The beautiful captive woman stands out because of her beauty. She's visually desirable, which is why the Ra'ita, right, the Israelite warrior, sees her, and then that is what triggers V'chashakta ba, his desire. And there's something very relevant and resonant about that process of seeing the woman, desiring her. And then notice what the Torah describes, V'lakachta lecha le'isha. This is not a description of a moment of lust which is satiated in the moment. The Torah basically says, and you would take her as wife. In other words, seeing the beautiful captive woman is not a moment of succumbing to lust. It's an invitation to take this woman as wife. That is what the Torah assumes the Israelite soldier is considering. And then what happens next is ve'eveta al toch beitecha v'gilchat rosha v'astat tziporneha, and you will bring her, says the Torah. Again, this is told very much in the form of a command. Once you're already in this process of desiring a woman and taking her, v'lakachta ota, then begin a series of rituals and responsibilities before she actually will become wife. And let's see what those are. You take her into your home. You can't leave her in the barn or in the field. She actually comes into beitecha, your home, your house, and then you gilcha et rosha. It's a question: are you shaving her head? Are you giving her a haircut? You are doing something. You are responsible for bringing her into your home and carrying out some rituals. On the face of it, the most obvious reading are rituals that clean her up, right? You cut her hair, you do her nails. The obvious reading is you pare her nails, and then v'hisirat simlat shivya me'aleha. You remove her garment of captivity from upon her, and then after she has gone through this process of hair cutting, nail cutting, removal of clothing, the clothing in which she was taken captive in, v'yashva b'veitecha, she sits in your home, uvachtat avia ve'et ima yerech yamim, she cries over her mother and father. There's a mourning process that the Torah is describing. First, there's a transition through cleaning her up, and then bringing her she's in your home, and she sits and she cries for yerech yamim, which is a month of days. Va'achar kein tavo elea uva'alta va'ita lecha leisha. And what you then have a description of, only then can you come in unto her and have sexual relations with her, and then she finally becomes wife. And so v'haita lecha leisha in chapter 13 really reconnects to verse 11, v'lakachta lecha leisha, right? She only actually becomes wife, becomes your woman, is open to you for sexual relations, which is a sign of marital intimacy, after she's gone through this process of the hair, the nails, the clothing, and the yerech yamim. That's not a short amount of time that she's sitting in your home and openly mourning for the life that is no longer. And then the Torah has one more verse, and for many modern scholars, this really emphasizes the humanity, really palpable in these psukim. V'haya im lo chafatzta ba v'shilachta l'nafsha umachor lo timkarena bakas lo titamer ba tachat asher inita. You must not sell her, the beginning of the verse, then should you no longer want her, you must release her outright. The Torah understands that after that moment of desire is met, right? Finally, you've had sexual relations, this beautiful woman, you've been waiting and waiting and waiting, and there's release. We saw that in verse 13. If you no longer desire her, it wasn't what you thought, it causes more tension in the household than is really worthwhile, then you must shilachta l'nafsha, wherever she wants to go, you must release her so she can go where she desires. You may not sell her for money. It's not because the Torah is taking a stance against slavery. In fact, captive men and women in the Torah are Canaanite slaves, or in the category of Canaanite slaves, and they can be bought and they can be sold. However, this woman, because she was taken into your home as wife, may not be sold for money. And then the Torah ends, lo titamer ba tachat asher nita, since you had your will of her, you must not enslave her. In other words, what you put her through, which was already a complicated process for a woman coming out of another tribe, another nation, into your home to be wife, the fact that you had sexual relations with her as wife, and then you want to discard her, you want to release her, that's a form of inui, says the Torah. Tachat asher inita, you've been the master over her. And it's interesting because, again, slavery is allowed. So why are we suddenly showing this kind of compassion for a woman who could have been slave if she wasn't singled out? Somehow the Torah is suggesting that then throwing her into the slave market would be a hideous form of abuse above and beyond what normal captives would experience on the slave market. I mean, that would be what they would expect. Somehow pulling her out of that, taking her into your home, transitioning her into the rituals and into the home life that is the Israelite household, and then rejecting her is considered to be an inui, a kind of mastery or domination that requires you to release her and not just begin to sell her on the market as a slave. And so if we take a look at the psukim, really it's actually quite fascinating to think about what is going on here. Really, we see elements of transition, of maybe purification, of somehow turning her into wife in a woman who comes from another culture, another nation, cannot go through the same marriage ceremony that the Bnei Yisrael or the Benot Yisrael would undergo. And so really the sexual relations at the end are the sign of the marriage. And modern biblical scholars interpret the parsha as a humane text that is intended to obligate the Israelite to behave with forbearance and to take into consideration the feelings of the woman. The Torah has mandated the desired conduct in a situation where there seems to be concern for immoral and uncontrolled behavior. Captive women have always been vulnerable byproducts of war from ancient times until today. The text seems to mitigate the possibility of physical or sexual violence by directing the soldier away from the battlefield and into the home. The rituals that she performs, or that she performs on herself. Perhaps I wasn't clear enough that the language of the Torah actually is vigilchat rosha v'astat tziporneha, is really that she trims her hair. She pares her nails. He doesn't force the rituals upon her. He guides her into these rituals, and she performs them on her own body. She removes her clothing. And so, certainly these rituals reflect possible mourning customs in the ancient Near East, or possibly transitioning the woman, and she goes through the transition process actively. She's then given a month to cry. And at the very end, she's transformed from status of captive to one of married woman within the community she has been forced to join. And early pre-rabbinic interpretation, and I'm talking about during the Second Temple period, the late Second Temple period, really reinforces the reading of the text as I have presented it. If we go back and we look at the Temple Scroll, which is coming out of the Dead Sea, the community down by the Dead Sea, Philo, Josephus, really early interpretations and translations of Torah, I want to just pause and read a little bit from Philo, because Philo, 70 CE, a Jewish philosopher in Alexandria, really, to me, understands what the Torah is getting at, and we're going to transition to rabbinic text and midrashic text. But before we do so, I want to read a little bit from this text that I think most powerfully reinforces a compassionate and humane reading of the Yafat Toar. Philo on the virtues 110 to 115. Moreover, if after having taken prisoners in a sally, you should entertain a desire for a beautiful woman among them, do not satiate your passion, treating her as a captive, but act with gentleness and pity her change of fortune, and alleviate her calamity, regulating everything for the best. And you will alleviate her sufferings if you cut the hair of her head and trim her nails and take off from her the garment which she wore when she was taken prisoner, and leave her alone for 30 days, during which period you shall permit her with impunity to mourn and bewail her father and her mother, and her other relations from whom she has been separated by their death, or by their being subjected to the calamity of slavery, which is worse than death. So Philo recognizes that her family may not be dead, but she's been separated by them, and if they've been taken into slavery, the thoughts of what their lives now look like are just unbearable. She needs to mourn that loss, and mourn that changed fortune of her family and her community. And after that period, you shall cohabit with her as with a legitimate wedded wife. For it is right that one who's about to ascend the bed of her husband, not for hire, like a harlot who makes a traffic of the flower of her beauty, but either out of love for him who has espoused her, or for the sake of the procreation of children, which should be thought worthy of the ordinances which belong to a legitimate marriage, on which account the lawgiver has given all his laws with great beauty. And basically Philo says, look, she becomes wife after the sexual relations. She's not a harlot. He's not ascending her bed as if she's a prostitute for hire. Essentially, either there is love there or for children. In other words, both love and procreation are two different aspects of the marital relationship. And, Philo admits not everyone gets married for love. Not everyone has sexual relations for love. And it's possible that, that part of the reason he's taken her is for procreation. And then the final paragraph, for in the first place, he had not permitted, meaning God, the lawgiver, has not permitted appetite to proceed onwards in its unbridled course with stiff-necked obstinacy, but he has checked its vehement impetuosity, compelling it to rest for 30 days. And Philo says, look, the purpose of the Torah is to give the soldier time to really think about whether he wants to bring this woman into his household with all that that's going to represent, all of the challenges that's going to represent, and it should not be based on lust, on unbridled lust. And in the second place, he has tested love. And again, he reinforces this. It's not only about neutralizing the appetite, the sexual appetite, but it's testing whether this was just a frantic passion or whether there might be pure essence of well-tempered reason. For reason will bridle the desire. And basically, at the end of the month, after he's seen her, after he's been forced to kind of watch her go through this process in his household, he will have to evaluate more rationally whether he wants to continue before he takes her as wife, before he has sexual relations with her as wife. And so I'm going to pause here and just summarize that the psukim in the Torah and the earliest strata of biblical interpretation, which is, as I said, pre-rabbinic, before Chazal begin writing down their interpretations, very, very compassionate and humane and recognizing the plight of this woman. And I'll also say the opportunity. In other words, I've talked a lot about the mourning that the woman is representing. She's going through a stage of mourning. She's transitioning. On the other hand, her beauty has caught the eye of the soldier so that she's being relieved from the terrible fate, as Philo says, worse than death, of slavery. So her beauty presents an opportunity. It also makes her vulnerable to being visible. So the Torah seems to understand that divide, or that the potential here to be wife, and at the same time the loss of her previous identity. Rabbinic interpretation drastically changes the way we read this parsha. Written down well after the Second Temple has been destroyed, Midrash Halacha from the Tannaitic period, ending at around 220 CE, encounters a reality in which Jews are no longer waging offensive wars which could result in captive women. The subsequent interpretation no longer needs to consider the practical consequence of bringing these women home, along with the possible impact such women will have on the Jewish community. In other words, the focus is not so much the practical consequence of captives of war. The concern is the possible impact bringing non-Jewish women will have on the Jewish household and on the Jewish community. It relates to the text in a multi-layered way, mining it for readings that will bring relevant ideas to the Jewish population it addresses. One Midrashic reading, heavily influenced by Rabbi Akiva's school of interpretation, sees the woman as Satan who will lead the Israelite man astray. And I'm now going to quote the text. It's in a text called Midrash Tanaim. And I'll say that really this Midrashic interpretation, which is quoted partially by Rashi, has had tremendous impact on how we read the Torah's parsha here, as often Midrash does. And we're not always aware even sometimes of how heavily influenced we are by Midrashic interpretation until perhaps we listen to a shiur or read an article in which it's called to our attention. So here is what the Midrash Tanaim has to say. When Rabbi Akiva used to interpret the meaning of this section, he would say, quote, "Ah, those who haul sins with cords of falsehood and iniquity as with cart ropes," end of quote. And that's a verse from Isaiah. This means that the beginning of sin is like a spider's web, and its end is like the cables that draw a chariot. How does this entire passage begin? When you take the field and you see among the captives a beautiful woman. Then one does it say, if a man has two wives, one loved and the other loved, one unloved and the other loved. This man brought Satan into his house, and from her he bore a wayward, defiant son, Ben Sora or Moreh. And what is the fate of the wayward and defiant son? To be a man guilty of a capital offense. So what happens here is Rabbi Akiva weaves together the four different scenarios, the distinctly different scenarios, each of which end with a samach in the Torah. So the Torah is basically telling us this is a sof, meaning each unit is an individual unit in and of itself on its own. Rabbi Akiva's interpretation comes and weaves together a thread through each of these subtexts in chapter 21 and links them together into a narrative. If you bring a captive woman home, then she will be the second wife who is unloved, and yet she will have the firstborn son. And that's not really fair, because you're going to have the firstborn son who inherits twice from the unloved wife. That's going to cause a lot of dissent and hostility in the household. And that firstborn son, he's going to become the Ben Sora Moreh, the wayward and defiant son, who will have to be stoned to death by the town's council. And if he survives that, then he will become a man guilty of a capital offense. In other words, if he doesn't become a Ben Sora Moreh in practice, in other words, only in theory, he acts like a wayward and defiant son, but he's not put to death, right? Because by the time Rabbi Akiva is writing, there is no capital punishment. The Beit Din is not executing anyone. So midrashically, that would not be his fate. What will be his fate is he'll become a man guilty of a capital offense. Essentially, he'll become a murderer. So if you bring this captive woman into your home, the terrible influence she's going to have on the family, on the community, on the nation is just incalculable. And Rabbi Akiva, throughout, in other midrashic interpretations as well, continuously sees the woman as a corrupting presence. Just to give two small examples, in the Sifrei Dvarim, another Midrash Tanaim, another Tanaitic Midrash on the Parsha, there's a contrast between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva, as I said, the woman is corrupting. Rabbi Eliezer understands that the Torah gives a woman a month to cry for her parents. We've already described that. The pshat, the simple reading is, she is being allowed to mourn in such a compassionate way the loss of hearth and home. Rabbi Akiva dismissively interjects that she is crying only for her idols. In one dramatic passage, Rabbi Akiva criticizes the woman for having adorned herself and gone out to the battlefield with her friends to seduce the children of Israel. He compares her to a pumpkin who will sit at the entrance to the home, bald because her head's been shaved, with nails that have grown into talons. Instead of cutting the nails are grown, and force the man to confront her in all of her literal and metaphorical ugliness. Through the prism of this interpretation, which deviates greatly from the more straightforward reading of the Torah, we can understand that Rabbi Akiva is taking a strong stand against foreign influences. These virtual captive women come from outside and embed themselves inside the community, despite the continuous warnings in the Torah itself that intermarriage with idol worshippers will turn the hearts of the children of Israel astray. And yet, in this case, the Torah is allowing it. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, we can't have any possibility of allowing intermarriage, even though the Torah brings an example in which it is allowed by the dictates of the Torah. In another midrashic reading of this parsha, Rashi brings an interpretation from the school of Rabbi Yishmael, another Tana. So we've seen Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer, and now I'm bringing Rabbi Yishmael. He explains the whole parsha as a concession to the evil inclination. According to this approach, the rituals serve as an attempt to neutralize the soldier's desire, either by removing her hair or nails or dress, in order to force the soldier to recognize what his desire has caused. According to Rabbi Yishmael, is it her hair that attracted him? Is it her nails? Because women would adorn their nails even in the ancient world, much like they do today with their gel manicures and their nail building. Or was it the clothing she was wearing? Just to remind the listener, we had read the Torah as largely cleaning her up, meaning I could bring lots of psukim to support that reading, that she's coming out of captivity in a state of unhygienic state, dirty clothing. It's what she wore into captivity. Here, Rabbi Yishmael says, like Rabbi Akiva, no, she's wearing beautiful clothing. That might have attracted the eye of the soldier. Her hair is beautifully adorned. Her nails are decorated. And so in order to neutralize his lust, what we have to do is remove all of those impediments. This is a little bit like Philo. How can we get him to rationally evaluate what he's done? Philo sees the end of taking her as wife as a positive ending. Rabbi Yishmael would see it as a negative, not in the same way as Rabbi Akiva, quite as starkly as Satan, but nonetheless, before you make this move, make sure you really evaluate what it is you are doing. And in both schools of Midrash, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael, sexual relations only take place after the rituals and mourning period. Really, that is in keeping with the verses of the Torah. So, up until this point, through the Tannaitic period, we don't really have battlefield rape as an option. Rabbi Akiva certainly wants to delay that moment so that he will send her away, he will reject her before it comes to the marital bed. Rabbi Yishmael wants to make sure that he's not coming to the marital bed in a kind of lustful haste, with frenetic passion, without any accountability or sense of what he's doing. So in all of the early Midrashic schools, really, the sexual relations are delayed in keeping with our reading of the psukim. So where did the idea of battlefield rape come from? Well, in an unprecedented manner, the Babylonian Talmud presents the permissibility of an initial act of sexual relations, what's called bia rishona, as a concession to the evil inclination. Now, the idea that the parsha is a concession to the evil inclination was seen in Rabbi Yishmael, who says, look, yes, he's allowed to bring her home because of his yetzer hara, but he's actually not allowed to do anything for 30 days. The Bavli comes along and says, how's that possible? If a man has a strong yetzer hara, if he has tremendous lust for this woman, we can't possibly expect him to wait for 30 days. And so the permissibility is for this initial act as a concession before beginning the process that will turn her into wife. And it's important to recognize that that is, a post-Tannaitic interpretation. In other words, as I've mentioned, this is no longer practical. I mean, this is not applied law by the time the Talmud is being written down. And really, I would suggest strongly that the Babylonian Talmud is reflecting on the yetzer hara. What does it mean to have an evil inclination, to be overcome by lust? And so the Bavli comes up with this very interesting and to some degree painful idea, if we think of it practically, that this would allow an initial act of sexual relations, essentially rape on the battlefield. I will just add two caveats, which is that the Bavli already suggests that the rape cannot, or the bia rishona, cannot actually be on the battlefield. He has to move her to a more discreet location before having sexual relations with her. And then the Rambam in Hilchot Melachim, chapter 8, adds that once he's had sexual relations with her, machnisa letoch beito, he can't just leave her. He actually must take her into his home. So even the what I would call the perhaps less compassionate reading, or the stronger emphasis on yetzer, on the lust of the Israelite man that allows for this bia rishona, this first act of sexual relations, nonetheless requires a continuation of the process when the war is over. He must take her into the home. He must at least go through the process until he is determined one way or the other to keep her as wife or to send her away. But there is accountability. It's not just a moment of lust and then off he goes. There is accountability, and I think that is important to reinforce in a reading that I believe is often taken out of context. And so this parsha illustrates the evolution in interpretation that exists between biblical text and rabbinic interpretation, what I've taken you through is really as careful a reading as possible of the psukim, a move towards early non-rabbinic interpretation during the Second Temple period, where we saw an affirmation of what I believe is the pshat, and then a movement towards Tanaitic midrash, the differences of opinion between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer staying closer to the Pshat reading, Rabbi Akiva really underscoring the concern he has for Gentile women coming into the Israelite household, Rabbi Yishmael, who focuses on how to neutralize the lust that has been triggered by the beauty of this woman, and we saw a little bit of how that interpretation worked, and then moving towards the later Amoraitic interpretation, which allows Bia Rishona, but certainly if we conclude with Rambam, who says that Bia Rishona then requires accountability and process and bringing her into his home, we see that there actually is a lot of humanity and compassion that continues to some degree, with the exception perhaps of Rabbi Akiva, throughout the layers and years of interpretation. And just to go back to the words of the Torah, contending with the reality of warfare, the Torah presents a moral and compassionate approach to a difficult reality in which Bnei Yisrael will find themselves, especially on the eve of going into the land of Israel and for many years after. And we can only take with us, perhaps, some of the lessons of humanity and compassion to those who are less fortunate and vulnerable among ourselves, within our families and our communities, and sometimes even outside. And perhaps that can be a message and a lesson we can internalize in the coming days.
Thanks for listening. You can stream and download all Matan podcast episodes on Spotify, iTunes, and Matan's website. Feel free to share feedback with us as you listen. You can write us at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Lastly, please do Matan Podcast and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new audiences. Shabbat Shalom.